idea that I brought up, that we need to cross our boundaries, the bubble that we live in, where we feel comfortable, that we need to reach out to other people who have different life experiences, who have different ideas. So we as monetary reformers, when I look around, so we're quite a homogeneous group. So I was very, very glad actually to see some diversity. So a Muslim with an Indian background, so from Nigeria, I think. So I think, bringing in that diversity and saying, monetary reform movement cannot just simmer in itself. We need to reach out, and we need to build coalitions between, I think you mentioned that coalitions that are not obvious at the first time. So I think that's what I've been trying to do. So even though what I suggested was the obvious coalition. So we need to build a coalition into the academic world. We need to build a coalition into the finance world. We cannot be the outsiders telling them how to do their business. That we say, well, you've been doing all your life, it has been wrong. We're questioning their life commitment, their investment, and start asking them to take a step back and question everything. So that's where I think we need to have these inroads in coalitions in other worlds, and that cannot stop at academia, finance. We need to have broader communities. We know that there are problems everywhere. So the problems here in Chicago might be similar to the problems in the rural areas. We've talked about that. There may be other coalitions, and we need to reach out to all these different groups, bring them in, ask what is your experience, how can we support each other, how can we help each other. So when I look at the monetary reform movement itself, it's very splintered. So there are many different organizations already out there, and I see more organizations forming. So my goal would be, how can we join forces, not only with monetary movement, so also the land tax movement, norm, then also parity, bringing all these different organizations in. So the problems that we're facing maybe just a different side of a medal. So that's so I was very glad to have the other two speakers following me. I thought it was reinforcing the message. We need to reach out and be more inclusive and build coalitions.
Okay, thank you.
I just want to talk a little bit about hope, and that change is happening. It never happens as fast as you want it, but there is change, real change happening. The old political regimes, which took it all for themselves, basically, and just left the scraps on the table for everybody else, those are truly collapsing. And it's happening on all but the very highest levels. I just believe over time that will fall also. You cannot ignore the majority of the people. It's just not sustainable. Too many people. I have 4 children, and I hear it from them. When we talk, that they recognize that they do not have the same opportunities that I did. Their parents, they fully recognize this, and they also recognize that the old ways are not working for them now, and they're certainly not going to work for them in the future. They struggle with where to go, but they know it's not the current political hierarchy. Things are changing. There's been, an obviously big swing, at least in appearance in Chicago. How far far that, goes, it'll be a matter of time. I was hopeful, and I'm hopeful that they will, ask for your input. There's many entrenched political insiders that are falling almost, every week, it seems like. and that's what needs to happen. To start leveling the benefit of the government, city of Chicago, Cook County, and state of Illinois, to everyone, not just a few. So I'm very hopeful. Things are changing. If you know where to look, you do see change, and it is going the right direction. But we have to be careful not to ignore our chance to get in and make a difference. It is, it's not easy to buck the trend, as many know. But I think there is hope. I think there is real hope. But boy, we have a long way to go.
Yes, well, as you may recall, I opened this conference on Thursday afternoon, mentioning a few times a supportive social environment to work within. And so that's what we're coming up to talking about now is how do we make that real? I mean, among ourselves, we come here and we keep in contact throughout the year. And we come here every year. We among ourselves are supportive, but we need more support. We need a bigger circle. So one of the things I've been struggling with for a few years is how do we do that one, and do we work towards our ultimate monetary reform through stepping stones like narrow banking or public banking or central bank digital currency. A couple of years ago at the International Movement for Monetary Reform meeting in Utrecht last year, I mentioned some of what went on there. One of the things that happened was that a large contingent came to Utrecht from the US, and we basically stacked the meeting to oppose a proposal to have watered down halfway house proposals on the manifesto of the IMMR. We thought at that time that was a retrograde step, and our concern is that if you ask for half of something, then you may get half, but then you may never get the second half. And another dilemma I've been struggling with for a couple of years is, as you recall, last year or the year before, Mark Pash was talking about how we need to work with the public banking people and even MMT, because we're at least talking about the same sorts of things and trying to raise awareness about how the system works. Now, I would like to do that, and I've got a reasonably good relationship with people in public banking and MMT. I haven't gone out of my way to build on that, but I'm wondering, in the back of my head, my concern is that if we've seen it before in political movements or social movements where sometimes there may be a marriage of convenience and people might conveniently move forward till they get to a point, and then at that point they'll split off and start fighting each other again, and it could undermine the point, getting to or keeping the point that you've reached. So I'm struggling with the strategy and how to work forward with that. So Joe he is, I think, firmly of the opinion of going for the the full reform, and Stephen Zarlinga certainly was, and Bob Poteet certainly was. But Dennis Kanega here thinks that we should focus on achieving a stepping stone goal first.
I'm not trying to cross the.
No, but Dennis has studied this, how the banking and accounting works in a great detail, and he has studied the narrow bank proposal, and so has Michael White here. And Michael's been studying the various monetary reform proposals around the world, and particularly what's been happening in Europe. And to my way of thinking, the leading group is the Netherlands group, and they are looking at establishing a public depository to give people a public option to have a safe bank account that cannot disappear by having it as a branch, basically, of the finance ministry, which would have an account at the central bank, and you could have your money there, and it would be, fully safe account. So, do you want to follow on from that and then pass over to Dennis and Mike?
Okay, so part of our discussion here this afternoon, late of Dr. Amia, if I say that right, has to do with the public banking question, and I'm also active with the Green Party Banking Monetary Reform Committee, and part of our committee's work has been to consider, some of these various options, and I hope that you will take a look at it, because we're at the back of the room. We actually have several of our publications, and one of them is on the public banking initiative. And I guess what I want to say is I've been a community economic development activist, pretty much all my whole adult life. So anything that I see that serves meeting the credit needs of any community, to me, ought to be enhanced and ought to be promoted in. And I take that position also with regard to public banking. So in other words, yes, I'm an advocate for public banking, but I'm not an advocate for any kind of public banking. And I kind of take a bit of exception to the Public Banking Institute's model, which they claim is based on the Bank of North Dakota model. But when you ask them how they're going to do the things that they say they're going to do, they say they're going to involve themselves with fractional reserve banking, which is the harbor of the scalawags that brought us about the entire banking and financial system in the world today. And the premise upon which they justify their move to fractional reserve banking is that, well, with our model, we're going to lend it, and the interest is going to go back to the community. We're going to come from the community first, and then go back to the community. It's not the same people. I guess I'm going to put it that way. You could say that in any financial arrangement. So the Bank of North Dakota, just wanted to say, because Tom has indicated some serious concern about the Bank of North Dakota, and I'm always speaking in terms of the financing model of the Bank of North Dakota being the superior model. That is to say, they acquire all of their financing funds from sources that exist at the time. In other words, there's money out there, it exists. However they do it, the Bank of North Dakota gets that money into their coffers and then proceeds with on the other side, a lending program. So we have a financing income side, a lending spending side. And the lending spending side, I've always said, the lending spending side of the Bank of North Dakota does not match up to their financing side. Financing side to me is sound. It's well found. It's where we should be using the model. But their lending side is obviously not, I'm going to say, not meeting the credit needs of the community because for the simple fact that they're not only 100% reserved, they're about 150% reserved. That is to say, they have $2 billion in unlent funds, and they have had that $2 billion balance in unlent funds for at least a half a dozen years now, and probably longer than that. So how come it is that there are people in the state of North Dakota that don't have a rest area on the highway for 125 miles, and yet there's $2 billion sitting in the Bank of North Dakota? And to me, that would only be like a microcosm of the nature of the problem. In other words, public banking doesn't solve it all. Okay, public banking can solve part of the credit needs of the community, but they need to be financed soundly without taking risks onto the public community, to the public community, through something like fractional reserve banking. Now, having offered that criticism of the Bank of North Dakota, I was also in Wyoming last week, and I went there because I was on my way to Bismarck, where Tom's from, and I was trying to meet with the chief financial officer of the Bank of North Dakota because I wanted to establish for the record, because so many of us are involved with this public banking question. Because we say they do not do fractional reserve banking, they do full reserve banking, and again, 150% full. And so I was trying to meet with the chief financial officer of the Bank of North Dakota to ask him the question, just straight out. And I told him, I called him from Indiana. I was on my way to Bismarck, I said, my wife and I are out camping, and I want to stop at Bismarck and have a chat with you with my camera running and just ask you one or two real simple questions that amount to, do you do fractional reserve banking? And quite frankly, he would not answer the question. And he didn't refuse to answer the question. His answer was no comment. So to me, I'm like, well, what kind of a public bank is that? When somebody can't walk in and ask if your banking model is based on fractional reserves or not. And that's where we're at with that question right now. And the Bank of North Dakota's chief financial officer has no comment on whether or not they do full reserve or fractional reserve banking. And yet we in this activist community trying to achieve social justice through reforms to the institutions that we have, run into a public institution like the Bank of North Dakota that refuses to answer that question. So having said that, if you don't mind, if it's okay, and I'm not trying to be trite at all, but the Kucinich AMI Need Act provides for the sharing of the revenues that are, I'm going to call them revenues, Jamie, I know sometimes accounting-wise, other incomes, okay, that are obtainable through monetary reform. And in a modern economy like we have today, in an $18 trillion economy, that if the government could finance itself through seigniorage gain from creating the new money, that the amount of that would be shared with the states is approximately $125 to $150 billion a year. That it would be distributed on a per capita basis. And that distributing on the per capita basis, if my figures for the population of Chicago are correct, and the state of Illinois are correct, would actually provide $760 million to Chicago every year. And that, to me, is the reason why monetary reform is the superior. The superior means for us achieving our socioeconomic good justice goals, because the amount of money that's available is actually, something that can be gladly engaged and managed by the public budgets and by the fiscal responsibility that we would put on them by providing them with the funds that they need to carry on their business. And so that's kind of my statement here, that we do need to have, I know that you're on the community loan bank, and that is one of the models, you know, that has come forward. Community development banking is another one that I would actually promote in front of public banking. But I would also promote public banking on the basis of it being soundly run and not taking the risks that are associated with fractional reserve banking, where there is not enough money in the bank to provide for the loans that are being made, and instead trying to create money by lending on the public banking institute model. I'll leave that. Sorry for the length of my comment. I'll pass this on to Dennis.
I've just mentioned that I am a supporter of public banking as well. I campaigned in New Zealand to get a government-run bank set up after the previous government banks had been privatised, and we did get our sheep. I banked with that bank, and that's good. But it's the four main banks in New Zealand are all foreign-owned, and they all send their billions of dollars of profits overseas. And the public bank, which is run through the post office, like most countries, post offices run banks. It has made an impact. It's like a small impact, you know. So it's a marginal effect. And we were talking in the morning session about the huge crises that are facing the world with ecosystem decline and needing to adapt to climate change and that. And you know, a kickback on the interest revenue on a public bank's interest profits is not going to fund all these massive infrastructure and investments we need to fund our education properly and our healthcare and all of that. It's just not enough dollars.
Yeah, there is, Jamie, I think was just alluding to there. It's not just in Europe, also here in the U.S. there are two what Jamie might call stepping stones to monetary reform proposals that were discussed at the American Enterprise Institute conference in December, and also at Harvard Law School's Money as a Democratic Medium conference, which was also last December. Basically, they're both about removing, just simply removing the special, the inordinate special privileges for banks, and if you do that, then that's pretty much their business model. We don't necessarily need a legislative approach to do that. Some people say just take away all these billions or trillions of dollars in subsidies, and that would pretty much be the end of it also. Let's see, welfare. I mean, even 100 years ago, Congressman Lindbergh, also from Dakota, also said that the greatest of all favoritism is that extended by the government to the money trust, and it's only gotten exponentially more so in the century since then. Century after that, this is a global system, not just a U.S. monetary system, obviously. Recently, Martin Wolf, the head monetary economic commentator at Financial Times in London, remarked that a bank today is about as unsound a financial structure as you can imagine. If I think they would be impossible without the government guarantees. Only banks enjoy this mega public protection. Sorry, I'm going to mangle a quote from June of this year by Miguel Ordonez, who was on the board of the Spanish central bank. This was at the Future Money Conference too in Sweden in June. Only banks enjoy this mega protection because all the money created by the bank is unsafe. Hence all the quote monstrous and suffocating regulation unquote all the quote monstrous and suffocating regulation is fully justified unquote because all the benefits of a bank are sustained by public taxes, and if those profits are reduced, then the first thing the banks are going to do, because it's their business model, is to ask regulators and the central bank to protect them. And that is until the general public intervenes. Again, quoting Ordonez again, same speech. The general public is important. I don't think this is going to come from the top down like a political performance. It's probably going to come from people who say, quote, why can't I also have an account at the central bank, unquote. Again, this is not just in Europe. At those two conferences last December, Professor Morgan Riggs at Vanderbilt, former Obama administration treasury official, publicly proposed to remove all the restrictions on reserve accounts at the Federal Reserve. It's real simple. Just take away not allowing businesses to have an account, regular businesses to have accounts there, remove the restriction even on us ordinary people, actual citizens, not just corporate personhood citizens having accounts at the central bank. And if you look at it this way, it really is, as a lot of the speakers earlier today were referring to, a form of discrimination. It is the government's, monetarily, it is certainly the government's largest form of discrimination monetarily. In allowing these only businesses that have the banking license to have access to all these myriad forms of bank welfare, which would take another presentation just to list them all. That relates to the other plan, the stepping stone type plan, which is actually not in Europe at all, but is rather very American centric, and that is Jamie McAndrews' plan to make a 100% reserve narrow bank. He actually calls it, quote, the narrow bank, unquote, which is fully legal. And McAndrews was the former head of research at the Federal Reserve. The research bank is the St. Louis one. He was there for 20, 30 years or whatever. And just recently he decided he's going to make his own bank charter and just make it a 100% reserve bank. And it meets all the stipulations and all the requirements of the charter. And it was approved by the state of Connecticut to have a license. And then he went to the Federal Reserve to get his reserve account, and the Federal Reserve just said no. And apparently they didn't even give him a reason why. About a year later, in last March, after he sued them, the Federal Reserve was the New York Fed, which is the regulatory purview for the state of Connecticut. The New York Fed officially admitted that The Federal Reserve officially admitted in their defense of the lawsuit that, I'm sorry, well, this is quoting the Wall Street Journal saying what the Federal Reserve said. I quote, "The Federal Reserve has very serious concerns that the narrow bank's novel business model could interfere with its ability to carry out the Fed's policy mandates." In other words, there could, if there's one narrow bank actually goes through, then it would be so easy for it to be profitable that they're envisioning like a stampede of copycat narrow banks. That would be another revelation of what the Federal Reserve business model has turned into, if it wasn't sort of always like that. Okay, last quote here. So Jamie McAndrews in March was contacted by the Wall Street Journal to react to what the Federal Reserve said. And he said that the Fed's new regulatory proposal, so the Federal Reserve reacted by saying that, well, if we approve McAndrews Narrow Bank, then we would really threaten everything because it would mess up the interest on reserve system, which is their primary policy management tool these days, not reserve ratio requirements, which everybody knows haven't been enforced for decades. So if they accepted, if they let McAndrews Bank have an account there, they said they could only do that if they made a new policy to pay less, a lower interest rate for quote large volume accounts. Anyway, so McAndrews said in response to that the Fed's new regulatory proposal, quote, is not founded on commonly understood banking principles and is inconsistent with the governing statutory framework. I guess that's nothing new for banks, given where'd he go? The guy from North Dakota, what he said today about the Bank of North Dakota's statute. Yeah, what Tom said about North Dakota. And with that, I will hand you over here to my friend, Mr. Kanega.
All right, Mike, that's wonderful, but I have a question for you. All of these people out here don't care about the inequality argument because they already have a better solution. So why did you tell these people all that stuff?
Well, I mean, it's structural inequality. What could be more structurally inequality producing than the huge sovereign government itself spending millions and hundreds of billions of dollars in a lot of ways it's the ultimate regressive taxation. Obviously, banks are the institutions with the large banks, at least, are the richest institutions on the planet. And the only reason they get away with finagling so much money from the federal government is because apparently nobody in the federal government, except maybe Morgan Riggs, understands. Jamie Andrews was at the Federal Reserve, which is not really part of the government. It's perhaps because Morgan Riggs is the only person in the government that actually understands what they're doing, and of course they can only do that, as Orwell pointed out in 1948. Well, in 1948 he published the book 1984 about how the supposed dystopian totalitarian future is just all based on words and manipulating the language so that people cannot talk about things. I think that was in the Matrix too. How can you do something you can't spend?
Yes, that's true, but these people already are opposed to the shenanigans of the banks, and they already know that the banks are cheating people, and they already have a better solution than Morgan Riggs and Jamie McAndrews. So the question again is, why would you tell them about a halfway solution when they've already got a better solution?
I think it's obvious the banks are so weak in any of these. There are many different ways to. I think it's obvious when one even just looks at the scope of bank welfare. There are many projections that interest is a couple years from now, perhaps, is going to be something like the largest discretionary item in the entire U.S. government budget. And furthermore, there are also projections that by 2023, the U.S. government will be spending more on interest rates than it even does on the Department of Defense. I mean, how crazy is that?
Okay. Since you're not going to answer my question, I'm going to have to answer it myself. There are the majority of people in this country that don't believe in what AMI is after. And they're afraid of jumping off the cliff. And this is a political issue. Let's assume we're all here in this room that everything that AMI proposes would work. Okay, we won't argue about that. That's not the end of the story. The story is, how do you get from A to B? And you have to get there, as has already been pointed out several times in several ways. You have to get there through the culture, through the history, and through the people that are in existence now. And the people that are in existence now generally they don't believe in citizens' dividends, or they don't trust the government for creating your money. There's a lot of political flack that isn't just coming from the establishment. It's general throughout the culture. People think that you should work. Even if you look at the parity issue, what the parity proposal is not to give people money, it's to give people work, and not just to give it to them. They already deserve it. It's to have it available. Depopulation is one of the biggest problems in this country, demographics, and we hear about it all the time. And what's the solution to that? I don't think fixing the banks, even if we did do that, automatically puts people back to work. We've got to do a lot more than that. So people are afraid of big jump off the cliff. And that's why this is an important thing, because it's not. What it is an American way of having a trial. You have an opportunity to establish a track record of data, of results that you can quantify. It's engineering thinking, scientific thinking, experimental thinking, that if you did this kind of narrow bank, this would be able to be tracked. There would be results from it. And it has the huge appeal. Let's forget the issue of fairness. It has a huge appeal that it doesn't really change anything. They're not even asking for any changes of any laws. It's exactly like what Randy Cook was talking about. The laws are already on the books. Everything is in place. It's been tried out. It works, and we're not asking for a big commitment on the part of people. People can go a little way, but they can't jump off the cliff. They don't believe that you know what you're talking about. But they would be able to go a little ways. And so what this approach is about is there are a lot of people in monetary reform that just think you have to work through the political system, and you have to work through the natural engineering, scientific inclination of the American people who want to see facts and figures. They want to see experimental trials. I mean, Paul Davidson was here, and he doesn't agree with jumping off the cliff. And he's a very smart man, and there are lots of smart people like that. So I'm not really trying to change your opinion. I know you're committed to the NEED Act, and I'm not because I don't think it wouldn't work. I just don't think it'll ever get 10 people to support it in the whole country. I mean, you can come for hundreds of years to committee meetings like this, but the other thing that you could think about is how to get someplace in the practical political realm. So I'm just leaving this thought with you that there are some things that would not compromise anything that you're working for. These don't compromise anything. I know you think they do, because if you just go part way, then there's going to be two different systems and they're going to be in competition and you'll never get all the way. But it's just as likely to work the other direction when people's eyes are opened by an experiment that is like a can opener, opening up how this monetary system that not one person in 10,000 has the faintest clue about how it works. If you could open their eyes up, that's what Jamie McAndrews is doing. He's opening people's eyes. He's entirely educational. He's not making, he might make a little profit, but that's obviously not his goal. His goal is just to have people realize that there is another kind of money, it's a better kind of money, and they should be able to get access. This is a very simple, like Mike says, it's a very simple American argument for this, opening up the privilege. Why should they have privilege? So the argument is just like falling off the log. It's an American apple pie type of argument.
I want to respond. I was also at Harvard, and I got to meet him, and I was there for his presentation. And he walked like a duck, talked like a duck, he quacked like a duck. To me, he could have fooled me because he really played the role of a banker really well. And so let's get into the situation of, and I want to bring up the idea of fire in a moment, and I'll wait for your responses. But what he wants to do is set up a bank, and when I was thinking through it as he's talking, he's got well-to-do Connecticut and other people putting their money in his bank. They're putting it straight into the Fed. The Fed's paying the interest rate on it, and they're collecting that interest rate, which just jacks up the money supply, because that interest rate now is coming through the Fed, which has a, what I explain to young kids, I've taught this in 5th grade, is that the Fed has a magic checkbook. I tell the kids, your parents don't have a magic checkbook, but the Fed has an actual magic checkbook.
The cup keeps overflowing.
No, well, it's bottomless. There's no way. So they can keep feeding the interest into that bank, and there's no worry, and the money keeps flowing in that direction. What work have they done to deserve any of that. What have they done to help productivity in any old way?
Hamilton, the musical.
Yeah. And it goes back to our old friend Hudson, you know, fire, it's the financial, it's insurance, the real estate. What is the productivity going on? The finance is the worst.
Thanks, Steve. We'll just park that good notion, and Joe just wants to respond from the panel of what's been said.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me go to where Stephen is, which is that they put the money in their bank, and then the Fed pays the interest on it. I'm sorry, Stephen, the Fed does not have a magic checkbook to pay interest. The taxpayers pay all the interest that the Fed pays on all the reserves. You're shaking your head no, Dennis? We haven't read the Fed's annual report, combined statements of all the Federal Reserve banks. I promise you that it is a deduction that happens just before they pay back the interest that we all have paid on the bonds that the Fed holds. And I'll bet you a dollar on that. Dennis.
Yeah, when you're thinking like that, Joe, I agree. Yeah.
Okay,
Do you want me to, do people understand just what happened here?
Talk.
Okay, just finish.
Because
You're fine, you're fine.
you know, I don't know where people might think that the Fed gets money in order to pay the interest, actually pay the interest on the reserves that are being held by the banks, no matter which bank it is, okay? But where they get it is they take our interest money that we pay on the bonds that they hold, that they created out of nothing. Dennis is still shaking his head no, so we're gonna have a little debate about this at dinner tonight, okay, Dennis? Let's you and I sit at the same table.
Wait, we're supposed to talk about parity at that table. And you're
But-
part of that too.
But that's the fact, okay? But that's the fact. The fact of the matter is that the taxpayers pay the interest, any interest that the Federal Reserve pays on reserves, and any interest that the Federal Reserve pays on anything, okay? The taxpayers pay it. It's deducted from the repayment of the interest that we pay to the Fed on the bonds that they hold. And I made that statement, and that's all there is.
It's not paid at all. It just goes towards our debt due, or owed. That's what I mean.
Yeah, and it's accounted
We
to
don't
be
pay,
doing
we say we will, so we sign our name to it, through the Fed's agency.
And you're talking now about the interest.
About what you're saying.
The interest rebate.
Yep.
He's
You
talking
say,
about the
when you say the people pay,
It's state aid.
I'm saying it's never paid, right? It's put towards our
What we owe.
name. It's
It's on the books.
subscribed to us in the public name, but it never gets paid, that's all. That's
To us,
It never gets paid to who?
to the citizens.
to the, well,
It never gets paid to the Fed.
It's an expense of the Fed.
It's an expense of the Fed, exactly. It's
That's
an
what we
expense,
said.
it's an expense of the Fed. Hey, Randy, let's, but the point that I wanted to make, which was before Stephen spoke, was with regard to what Dennis said. And that is that, I guess maybe I need to remind us all that the people of the United States of America never chose the Federal Reserve banking system. Okay? So for us to talk about, well, we can't replace the Federal Reserve banking system because the people of the United States will never select that, is to me a rather rubric of a way to look at how politics works. What they did do, and what we can do, is they had a National Monetary Commission that in theory studied what the problem was with the monetary system at the time and came out with a recommendation of a rather twisted version of the Federal Reserve Act that became the Federal Reserve Act. So my point is that, yes, we can inform the public about what the monetary system is all about through a National Monetary Commission, and that is the proper intermediate step, not, to me, not having these various, minor models of what kind of things might work. Go for a National Monetary Commission, understand how the monetary system works, and provide for consideration of alternatives, and the NEED Act will be the winning alternative. That's what I believe, and that's why we need to move in that direction.
Yes, just to add to that, when various groups have done surveys asking politicians or asking general public, how do you think our banking system works? And as Nick Ignatz gave in his presentation on Thursday, 80 to 90+% of people think that the government creates our money now. 80 to 90% of people think that banks take savings from depositors and lend them out to borrowers. And 80 to 90% of people think that the government should repair our bridges that are collapsing and our dams that are at risk of collapsing. So I think that 80 to 90% of Americans would support the need act. It's just that they think that we've already got it now. And when in those surveys, like one that the International Movement for Monetary Reform did, of the small percentage of people who did understand how the banking system works, a minority of them agreed with it. Only 4% of the surveyed people understood the way the system works and agreed that that's the way it should work. So it's 4% is a pretty small minority. Dennis.
All right, is it time for,
Yeah.
meal?
And on that happy note, it's time to eat and try and avoid a food fight.
Thanks for coming to my rescue.